Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 22nd, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Texas Democratic Party and their analyzation of what went down in the 2020 election, more specifically, what went wrong with the 2020 election results when Donald Trump was able to win the state by 5.6%. Many things were pointed out against the Democratic Party that they didn't do exactly what they sought out to do. Leading into the Texas general election, there was a Senate race at stake, every single House race, and a number of down-ballot statewide races, including, of course, the presidential race that was super important for the outcome of the presidential election and the outcome of Texas in the future. The state house was within reach for the Democratic Party. They didn't end up getting it, but they certainly made a lot of progress. This report breaks down what went wrong, but also highlights partially what went right and how the Democrats can correct it moving into the future and how they can turn Texas from being a ruby red state into a blue wall state. What I mean by blue wall is going across the southern border of the United States, we could see a new part of the country becoming the solidified Democratic Party wall. As the blue wall was mentioned in the Rust Belt, if that region starts to become more and more Republican as it has over the past few years, we could start to see Texas, Georgia, and Arizona take place of those three states. But looking at this long PDF, we're going to highlight a couple of key things that are super important to note as we go through it. I actually read this entire thing this morning. I read through it because they released it. I guess it was leaked to the press, but we're just covering it. So it's going to be very interesting, and there are a lot of things to cover. You can take a look right here at the, the list of everything that's going to be in this table of contents. That's the right three words for it. But looking at everything that we're going to be covering, there's a lot. There's a lot to go through, and we're going to try to condense this into just a summarization of everything. You can find this on the Washington Post website, but I just downloaded it, so you're going to see that little, list of the PDF name and everything, but so far, just ignore that. So the first thing that they brought out, they talk about horse race polling, and they talk about the accuracy of it. And, they said that the most concerning thing was that it overestimated Democratic support, and this entirely was true. The Democratic Party was widely expected to do better in Texas than they actually did. Looking at the forecast in Texas, Joe Biden had a nearly 40% chance of winning the state's 38 electoral votes. If you take a look at the popular vote expectation, it was expected to go within 2 percentage points. That didn't end up becoming true. Donald Trump was able to win the state by around 5.6%, very similar to this margin right here, actually. This is a 6-point margin of victory for the Trump campaign. But looking right around here is what the final results were. And, looking at Joe Biden's performance, it was one of the best performances for the Democratic Party, but polls consistently overestimated Democratic support. We can actually take a look at the Texas general election polling data. They expected Donald Trump to win the state by 1.1%. He ended up winning it by 5.6%. Now, I understand that while it did predict a Trump victory, things were supposed to be much closer. And leading up to the election, Joe Biden and Donald Trump were neck and neck throughout almost the entirety of the polling season. Never once throughout the entire time that we've had polls from March 2020 onward had Donald Trump led by a margin of 3 points or higher. Led by 3, but no higher than, middle of threes. And, never by 5.6%. Never, ever by 5.6%. Even for a brief period of time, Biden took the lead in Texas. And, I think largely we expected these polls to be right because they've had a very, very long time to correct themselves. They were accurate partially in 2018. And, they had always overestimated Republican support. Take a look at Texas in 2016, for instance. Trump was expected to win by 12 points, ended up winning by 9. Looking in 2012, Romney was expected to win by 17, won by 16. Taking a look at 2018, let's see if we can find it here. I don't know if we'll be able to, but the overall numbers were Cruz plus 7. He ended up winning by just shy under 3 percentage points. So this was supposed to be, maybe an indicator that Democrats could have won Texas, but it was wrong. And it threw them off by a lot. And, they cover pretty much the own predictions from the Democratic Party, what they expected to do. But the thing that they are highlighting in terms of what went well is the fact that Joe Biden came the closest to flip Texas in 1/4 of a century, 25 years. Hillary lost by 9. Obama lost by 12 in 2008, by 16 in 2012. Kerry lost by 23 percentage points. Gore lost by 21 percentage points. Biden came very, very close to flipping Texas. It wasn't enough, but it certainly was close. They came within 23,000 votes of flipping the Texas House, and they did well in a number of regions. On top of that, This is the second most amount of growth in Democratic vote share since 2012, only second to Utah, when Mitt Romney won the state by nearly 50 percentage points when Donald Trump won it by just 20 in 2020. But looking at what went well, there are a couple of silver linings for the Democratic Party, but it wasn't enough to flip it. And, they actually break down these 631,000 votes that separated Donald Trump and Joe Biden in terms of this margin, this very, very close margin relative to Texas's performance for Republicans in the past. Looking at those 600,000 votes that separate the two, they break it down. The net persuasion effect is 2.7% of this overall deficit. What does that mean? Well, a net persuasion effect pretty much just deals with voters that were previously Democratic voters, but voted for the Republican Party in just this election. But 13.9% is attributed to the GOP voter registration surge. We'll get to that in just a moment. 24.2% was to Republican turnout over performance. We will also get to that. That was something that really crippled the Democratic Party in Texas. And then the baseline electorate disadvantage was 59.1% of the vote. That's a lot of the vote, but that's exactly what was expected. It pretty much just says, if no one did any campaigning, this is the margin by which Republicans would be expected to win the state. So they were already expecting to lose, but this just added to it. They could have lost by just 373,000 votes, which would have been spectacular for Biden. And not to say the result wasn't good, but it's still a loss. And this would have been a loss too, but by 300,000 votes less. And that's what we see in terms of the deficit here, is that 59% was expected, and then the rest was added on due to convinced voters, which wasn't actually a lot, but still, voter registration surge and turnout. So let's go through this. The first thing they mentioned with turnout is the fact that Republicans had higher turnout, and that is true. If you take a look at the Democratic turnout in terms of what actually happened versus what was expected, the line is the expected, and then the dots are where they actually did. So as you can see, for a little bit, the Democratic Party was matching the line, went over it. That's good, right? But we also know that this election was high turnout on both sides. When you add in the Republicans, well, at every single step, and I mean that, every single one except for this one right in the beginning, Republicans outperformed Democrats in terms of the amount of voting versus expected. This is standard turnout. This was 2020 turnout. But the Republican Party did better at every single step. And that's what ultimately handed the Democratic Party a larger defeat than they would have had. And when you take a look at it, this graph here essentially shows you, when it's above the 0.0, that means Democrats outperformed Republicans. When it's below the 0.0, that means Republicans outperformed Democrats. And we can actually read through this. It's the same thing as we're seeing up here, but it really shows you that almost every single step of the way, literally 90% of them, we saw the Republican Party outperform the Democratic Party at very important steps. And, they ask about why did Republicans win turnout? And they pretty much said their turnout work was hampered by two factors. Inability to do in-person canvassing, which I completely understand, but the Republican Party was very quick to return to in-person canvassing, and inefficient targeting. And I think that both of these are equally true, as they point out here. They say, as we will show later, inefficient targeting is partially a symptom of our inability to do in-person canvassing because we were not able to effectively reach large portions of our base for whom we lacked quality contact information. Phone quality data was particularly lacking amongst low to moderate propensity voters, making it hard to reach those who are our top strategic priority to reach. It's no secret that Republicans vote at higher rates than Democrats. It's no secret that white Americans vote at higher rates than any other demographic group, with a few exceptions. But the general rule of thumb is, all elections being equal, whether it's 2020, whether it's 2016, whether it's 2014, whether it's 2011 Virginia governor race, doesn't matter. The standard is that the older you are, the more you vote. The more affluent you are, the more you vote. If you're white, you vote at a higher rate than almost every other demographic group. Combine that all into an older population, a whiter population, a very prominent part of the Texas voting population, and that's how you land the Republican Party in victories after victories. So because they couldn't in-person canvass, they could no longer target these people. And, for those of you who are watching this, who did do calls, they worked for the Democratic Party, volunteered for Biden's campaign. You volunteered for MJ Hager's campaign, or really anyone across the country. You will know that you don't get a lot of pickups. That's standard for any type of calling system. But what you will notice is that when you call voters, 10 of them out of 11 won't pick up. And of the one you do answer, that does answer, they will usually be apprehensive about talking to you. Well, when you're going door by door in a safe year, a non-pandemic year, you're going to get a much higher response. Calling voters isn't always the best way to communicate, especially if voters aren't exactly as, they are economically challenged. They are affected by the economic collapse. They don't have a phone. They can no longer afford their phone bill. When you make those calls and you hear the dial tone saying, this phone is out of service, well, there might be a reason for that. And that's just one voter you no longer have access to. But going in person, well, you can knock on the door. You can catch people by their garage. You can catch people on their way out. You can talk to them. You can drop off literature. But calling may not be always the most efficient way of doing it. And they actually evaluate the effectiveness of various voter contact approaches. What do you notice? Door knocking works better than manual dialing. Door knocking in the suburbs works better than manual dialing. Door knocking in urban regions does better than manual dialing. Now, looking at what happens is, because the Republican Party was not nearly as afraid as COVID-19 as the Democratic Party, and I'll say that very honestly, there's a reason why Biden didn't hold in-person rallies and Trump did. The Republican Party was very quick to return to in-person canvassing, and that actually was something that benefited them. And one thing I want to point out, found this out today, and I was very disappointed to find this out. You cannot register online in Texas to vote. You can't register online. You can fill out your information online and then mail it in after you print it out, but that would require internet access, computer access. That would require sustained computer access. I mean, talking about a very long period of time. You couldn't just be on the phone with someone. They would actually have to give you the physical document. You'd have to have access to a number of things to mail it out, a home address, a return home address. I mean, we're talking about this being a system where people couldn't just go to an internet cafe and register to vote. And, it's something that I honestly think is affecting those groups of voters who typically could vote or would vote if they were given the option, but just simply can't register. And that's partially why the Democratic Party also saw something, negative. And, what we're going to skip over the canvassing targets because this just has to do with in-person canvassing and what the Democratic Party was targeting. But they also talk about the limitations of phone numbers and how the voters that they needed to contact, they contacted at twice the rate. But those who they contacted once answered at a much higher rate than those they needed to contact, which just pretty much exemplifies that phone calling doesn't always work. And we arrive at these conclusions that they need to consistently invest in direct voter contact as much as possible, especially to newer voters or those with inconsistent voting history. As soon as it is safe, they will begin knocking on doors across the state. Simply put, they need to return to in-person canvassing. But they also talk about turnout. Latino turnout was lower relative to expectations than other groups, but in absolute terms, it was higher than projected. What does that mean? Well, they expected Latino voters to vote, coinciding an increase with other minority voters and other demographic groups in the state. And while it was higher than what the overall expected turnout was, it was lower based off their expectations, given that other demographic groups, specifically Asian voters, voted at a much higher rate than expected. So let's take a look as we go through this data. It's pretty interesting. But looking at the overall takeaway from the previous few points, voter contact is fundamental, especially reaching out to those in economically disadvantaged areas, minority voters, rural voters, whatever it might be. That's how Texas Democrats can win in the future. And we will talk about their plan by the end of this. So they talk about turnout rate growth and by party support relative to expectations by ethnicity. You can take a look at this. We're not going to be focusing too much on it. We're just going to be talking about each group. So main thing, these groups aren't monolithic. They vote differently. They aren't always going to be the same way around the state. They do vote in very different regions for very, very different reasons. And ultimately, turnout does depend on the county by county basis, on the region by region basis, and of course, state by state basis. But since we're just talking about Texas, we're going to just talk about that one. But they talk about black turnout. They say black turnout overperformed expectations, but Republicans were more successful in activating their black voters than Democrats. This is likely explained by limited phone data and availability for black voters and not enough fieldwork targeting low to moderate propensity voters. These means voters that don't always vote, voters that might have voted once in the past 20 years. Those are the voters the Democratic Party needed to target, and if they weren't getting answers, they weren't getting responses, it became increasingly more difficult. And as we go through, you will see that, this is a standard thing. The same thing with Latino voters. They don't agree that this 12-point shift is true, but they do agree that Republicans, specifically Latino Republicans, turned out at higher rates of Latino Democrats. They said it's more accurate to say Latinos who are already Republicans turned out more than Latino Democrats. Period. That's it. That's the truth about this. But they also mentioned the Rio Grande Valley, and they talk about how many heavily Latino areas, especially the RGV, broke for Trump. Bad performance amongst Latino districts were driven by differential turnout and persuasion. However, Latinos in most of the states supported us roughly as much as 2016. Losing ground amongst Latino communities appeared to be explained by the differential turnout. What that means is Latino Republicans just turned out to vote. And that was the problem for Democrats. Not reaching these voters, not giving them the information to vote by mail, not giving them the information. Sometimes, in Texas, you couldn't vote because of the pandemic by mail. You had to have a valid reason, and apparently that wasn't one of them. But looking at, we're going to skip through this because we don't need to focus on it too much. It's just pretty much reiterating exactly what we've been talking about. The main thing was, because the Republican Party in Texas was doing in-person canvassing, they reached these voters that don't always vote at a much higher rate. They reached these voters to get them out to register, and by the end of it, Republicans came ahead. So in terms of the Latino support conclusions, pretty much they just say that we saw a significant increase in support for President Trump in rural counties. It pretty much had to do with a little bit of those who were previously Democrats that flipped over to the Republican Party, but also reaching voters. That was the main thing. And also just looking at voters that are Democratic voters but don't always vote, that's who they need to contact. That is who they need to contact, and they need to specifically reach out to these Latino communities and build an infrastructure the same way that Stacey Abrams was able to do. And they actually quote her quite sometimes. And then they talk about looking at the turnout battle and overall in rural, suburban, and urban areas, Republicans outperformed them, which is why they won in literally every single region in terms of expectations versus actual result. And voter registration is exactly what they finish off. And they say that, looking at the demographic data, it's not about density, it's an opportunity. Approximately 1.49 million Democrats registered to vote since November 2018. So what they did was they were able to match the Republican Party in terms of registering voters leading up to around mid-2020. But then the Republicans completely took it away. Not only matched, did better than Republicans. By the end of it, Republicans ended up making up that deficit significantly. Let's take a look. So total voter registrations by voter party affiliation. What happened was from 2018 onward, leading to around mid-2020, the Republican Party started ramping up their efforts tenfold. And what happened was they started losing. See, this increase was Democratic vote share increasing or Democratic registration increasing. It shows the gradual voter registration advantage built up by Democrats, including the late surge by Republicans. Approximately 150,000 more projected Democrats registered to vote than Republicans in the 2020 cycle. But what do you see? Steady increase, but nowhere near as large of this increase for the Republican Party by the end, enough to counteract a lot of these small bumps month after month after month. And, they talk about the total net Democratic votes because those who register don't always vote. And it turns out that Republicans ended up ahead. They said Republicans actually earned over 26,000 net votes from voter registration when counting only those who voted. So Democrats might have been able to beat them in the registration game, but lost in terms of those who actually turned out to vote. So the point is, by the end of this, is that voter registration is important and getting them out to vote is super important as well. There are more Democrats to register than Republicans. The Texas Democratic Party recognizes that, they realize that, and they will use that to their advantage. So let's talk about that plan. Their winning sustainably plan has to do with the same thing that Stacey Abrams did. These are the few conservative assumptions that will allow them to reach a blue Texas by 2024 and possibly 2026. Relatively consistent partisanship amongst existing Democrats and Republicans. 100,000 net Democratic registered voters in non-presidential cycles, 150,000 in presidential cycles. Slight decline in Republican turnout advantage due to aging and immigration in Texas. Improvement in get-out-the-vote campaigns and turnout performance. However, none of our turnout estimates are as favorable as our estimates of what happened in 2018 when Beto O'Rourke came within 3 percentage points of winning the Texas election. But what do we see? This is where their path to going blue. Path to purple and path to blue. In 2018, they lost by 200,000 votes. In 2020, they lost by 600,000 votes. But what they expect in 2022 with those conservative estimates is to lose by just 232,000. Worse than 2018, but certainly better than 2020. They expect to win the state in 2024 by 1,000 votes. Keep in mind, looking at the amount of voters in Texas in this election, there were nearly 11 million voters. In 2024, there will be more than that, hopefully. And looking at the 1,000 vote margin, it'll be one of the closest elections in Texas history. But that's what the Democrats are hoping for. They're hoping from going in the negative to in the positive. And this has to do with net persuasion effect, voter registration, turnout performance, baseline turnout deficit that they're accounting for. This is the first time Democrats were able to overcome this huge gray barrier. By 26, they expect to win it by over 150,000 votes. By 2028, by 380,000 votes. So the pathway to purple and the pathway to blue relies on these major, sustainable victory plans by the Democratic Party in Texas. Do I think it's possible? Absolutely. I remind you that Georgia voted for Romney by 9 points, the same way that Trump won Texas in 2016 by 9 points. 4 years later, Trump won Georgia by 5.5% or 5.3% in 2016. Trump won Texas in 2020 by 5.6%. In 2024, we could see Texas become the next Georgia, going to the Democrats by just a few thousand votes of less than 1 percentage point. And that's exactly what could happen, what we could expect to happen, looking at this sustainable plan. If they follow in the steps of Stacey Abrams, I have no doubt in my mind Texas could become the next Virginia, or possibly, at a more conservative estimate, the next Georgia and the next Arizona. So, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.